On the 17th of October, 1972, in a fourth-floor apartment overlooking the quiet Piazza Mattei in Rome, a woman known as Sylvie Lefebvre applied a mixture of Dammer varnish and rectified turpentine to the corner of a small, darkened canvas. Her movements were a study in disciplined economy, each sweep of the squirrel hair brush precise and deliberate, her focus absolute. The air in the sparsely furnished room was thick with the scent of linseed oil and old pigments, a smell that clung to the raw plaster walls and the simple wooden furniture. To any observer, she was the embodiment of her carefully constructed legend, a freelance art restorer from Lyon, France, spending a season in the Italian capital to study the techniques of the Baroque masters while taking on small commissions to fund her stay. Her portfolio, filled with expertly aged photographs of restored icons and minor portraits, was a testament to a plausible, if modest, career. Her Italian was fluent, spoken with a faint, melodic French accent that charmed the local shopkeepers. Her life was a meticulously arranged tableau of quiet artistic pursuit. Yet, the true art being practiced in that sunlit room had nothing to do with the conservation of paintings. The small ceramic bowl containing her varnish mixture sat on a leather-bound copy of Dante's Inferno, a specific edition that served as a one-time pad for deciphering coded messages. The fine needle she occasionally used to clear a clogged brush tip was, in fact, a tool for manipulating the delicate internal mechanisms of microtransmitters. Sylvie Lefebvre did not exist. She was a ghost, a sophisticated psychological and biographical construct, and the woman inhabiting her skin was a field officer, a Katza, of the Israeli Mossad, her operational designation Alona. Her true purpose in Rome was not the study of chiaroscuro, but the systematic dissection and destruction of a human network that was turning the city into the primary logistical hub for Palestinian terror operations in Western Europe. The strategic problem facing the Mossad in the autumn of 1972 was both acute and diffuse. The massacre at the Munich Olympics a month prior had been a brutal declaration of a new phase in the conflict, one that would be fought not on the battlefields of the Middle East, but in the airports, embassies, and public squares of European capitals. Intelligence flowing into Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv from a variety of sources painted a grim picture of a metastasizing threat. A specific and highly disciplined faction of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP, had established a sophisticated and dangerously effective logistics network with its nexus in Rome. This was not a simple gun-running operation, it was a clandestine supply chain for the instruments of modern terrorism. Shipments of Czech-made Semtex-H plastic explosives, far more stable and powerful than traditional dynamite, were being moved alongside advanced, barometrically triggered detonators designed for aviation targets, and Soviet bloc Tokarev pistols fitted with custom sound suppressors. The network's methodology was its greatest strength. It piggybacked on legitimate import-export businesses dealing in olive oil, textiles, and machine parts, hiding its deadly cargo within otherwise banal shipments, rendering routine customs inspections almost entirely ineffective. The intelligence suggested that the weapons and explosives being stockpiled were not for opportunistic attacks, but for a coordinated, multi-city offensive intended to eclipse the horror of Munich. The stakes were therefore not merely retaliatory, they were preemptive, a desperate race to avert a looming catastrophe that could claim hundreds of civilian lives across the continent. The necessity for an audacious, unconventional operation was underscored by a litany of failures. Conventional intelligence-gathering methods had proven utterly impotent against this new Roman network. Signals intelligence, the bedrock of modern espionage, yielded nothing of value. The network's leadership, demonstrating a keen understanding of their adversaries' capabilities, had imposed a draconian policy of electronic silence. All communication was conducted face-to-face, through couriers, or via a system of elaborate dead drops scattered throughout Rome's labyrinthine streets and ancient ruins. Attempts to penetrate the organization with human assets had been met with catastrophic results. The cell was structured around deeply intertwined family and clan loyalties, a social fabric woven from decades of shared history and struggle in the refugee camps of Lebanon and Jordan. Outsiders, particularly other Arabs, were viewed with intense, almost pathological suspicion. In the preceding 6 months, 2 promising Mossad informants, both Palestinian expatriates recruited in Germany, had been sent to Rome to try and infiltrate the network's periphery. Both had vanished. Weeks later, their bodies were found in a ditch off the Appian Way, their deaths serving as a chilling testament to the cell's ruthless counterintelligence capabilities. Technology was failing, and traditional human intelligence was failing. The target was a closed, tightly sealed system, and the Mossad's leadership reluctantly concluded that the only way to break it open was to design a key so unique and unexpected that the lock itself wouldn't recognize it as a threat. The central challenge, the ghost at the heart of the machine, was the network's architect and commander, a man named Wells Waiter. A detailed Mossad psychological and biographical profile, compiled from informant reports, academic records, and surveillance intercepts from his time in Libya, portrayed a figure who defied the simplistic archetype of a terrorist leader. Zwaiter was not a brutish thug or a wild-eyed fanatic, he was a man of letters, a published poet, and a respected translator of Arabic literature, most notably having completed the first Arabic translation of the 1001 Nights into Italian. He was 40 years old, multilingual, and moved with effortless grace through Rome's leftist intellectual and artistic circles. His cover as a Libyan embassy translator was thin, but his carefully cultivated persona as a Palestinian man of culture provided him with a far more effective shield. He was a regular at the Café Greco, debated philosophy with Italian academics, and attended gallery openings. This intellectual veneer was, according to the Mossad's analysis, his most formidable defense. It disarmed suspicion and provided him with a wide, unwitting network of casual contacts and a perfect rationale for his constant meetings in public places. Operationally, he was a phantom. He maintained no fixed address, rotating between several safe-house apartments owned by sympathetic Italian nationals. He never followed a predictable routine, his daily movements appearing random and improvisational. He was known to employ subtle counter-surveillance techniques, such as stopping abruptly to gaze into a shop window to check his reflection for a tale. The profile concluded that Zwaiter was a paradox, a romantic poet who organized the shipment of explosives, an aesthete who plotted mass murder. This duality made him exceptionally dangerous, as he possessed both the ideological fervor to kill and the intellectual sophistication to do so with clinical, detached efficiency. He was a target who could not be approached through conventional channels of ideology, money, or blackmail. Within the heavily secured confines of the Mossad's planning division, a new strategy began to coalesce, one born of the psychological profile of their target. The proposal was codenamed Operation Fresco, a nod to both the intended cover of the operative and the delicate, layered approach the mission would require. The central thesis was audacious and rooted in a deep, almost literary analysis of Zwaiter's character. The psychological unit argued that the very intellectual vanity and cultural sophistication that served as his armor was also his greatest vulnerability. He was profoundly wary of political overtures and would instantly detect the false notes of a fellow Arab attempting to infiltrate his circle. However, the analysts hypothesized that he possessed a specific blind spot, a cultured, non-political, Western European woman who could engage him not on the level of the Palestinian cause, but on the level of his intellectual passions, art, literature, and philosophy. The plan was not a honey trap in the traditional, sordid sense of seduction and blackmail. Such a crude approach would likely be sniffed out by a man of his paranoia and intelligence. Instead, the goal was to cultivate a platonic, intellectual friendship, a meeting of minds that would grant an operative unparalleled proximity. The mission's objective was twofold: first, to leverage this proximity to meticulously map his network of contacts, identify his couriers, and pinpoint his logistical infrastructure; second, to create an opportunity to neutralize him, but only after the network he commanded had been fully compromised. It was a plan that relied less on gadgets and weapons and more on a deep, sustained, and perilous psychological performance. The obstacles to the success of Operation Fresco were formidable, and they were analyzed with brutal honesty by the mission planners. The primary challenge was human, finding an operative who could not only play the part of a European intellectual but who could, for all intents and purposes, become one. This required more than just language skills, it demanded an innate and deeply ingrained cultural fluency. The operative would need to be able to discuss the nuances of Caravaggio's use of tenebrism, the structural innovations of Italo Calvino's novels, and the political subtext of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy with genuine, unfeigned authority. Any hesitation, any factual error, any slip in the complex cultural grammar of that world would instantly betray her. The construction of her cover identity, her legend, would have to be flawless, capable of withstanding not just casual inquiry but potentially the intense scrutiny of a paranoid and hostile intelligence service. Every element of her backstory, from her supposed childhood in Lyon to her art studies in Paris, would need to be supported by a deep well of verifiable documentation and fabricated memories. The technological challenges were secondary but no less critical. How could an operative in such close and constant contact with a hyper-aware target exfiltrate intelligence safely? Any use of conventional radio equipment would be too risky. Any physical device she carried would be a liability. The entire communication and data-gathering protocol would have to be reimagined, relying on subtlety, concealment, and methods that left no trace. Finally, there was the profound psychological risk to the operative herself. Maintaining such a deep and complex deception for an extended period, while in close proximity to a charismatic but deadly adversary, would exert an almost unbearable mental strain. The line between the constructed identity and the real self could begin to blur, a dangerous psychological territory from which some operatives never fully returned. The mission was a high-wire act without a net, where a single misstep would mean not just failure, but the almost certain death of the agent. The search for the right operative led the Mossad to Ilona. She was not a typical field agent. Born in Paris to Israeli diplomats and raised in a multilingual, cosmopolitan environment, she had spent her formative years in Europe before moving to Israel for her military service. She possessed a degree in art history from the Sorbonne and had, before being recruited into the Mossad, worked for a time at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. She was fluent in French, Italian, English, and Hebrew, and her knowledge of European art and literature was not a trained skill but an organic part of her identity. Her psychological profile was equally compelling. Evaluations noted her exceptional emotional discipline, a high tolerance for ambiguity and isolation, and a rare capacity for what the Mossad psychologists termed identity immersion, the ability to fully inhabit a cover identity without losing the core of her operational self. Her motivation was deep and personal. Her maternal grandparents had been killed in a terrorist bombing in Brussels a decade earlier, a foundational trauma that had instilled in her a cold, unyielding conviction. She did not see her work as a political game or a patriotic duty in the abstract sense. For her, it was a deeply personal and necessary act of historical balancing. Her preparation for Operation Fresco was an exhaustive, 9-month process of transformation. She was sequestered in a mock-up of her future Roman apartment, located in a secure facility near Haifa. There, she lived as Sylvie Lefebvre, speaking only Italian and French, her days filled with a grueling curriculum. She spent hundreds of hours in practical skills training, learning to mix pigments and apply gold leaf from a retired master art restorer. She practiced advanced counter-surveillance drills in the streets of Tel Aviv, learning to detect and evade even the most subtle forms of surveillance. Her psychological conditioning was relentless. She engaged in daily, hours-long role-playing scenarios with other Mossad officers playing the part of Zwader, testing her ability to maintain her cover under intense questioning and psychological pressure. They probed for weaknesses in her legend, baited her with political arguments, and tested her emotional responses, training her to project a consistent persona of thoughtful, slightly naive, apolitical artistry. The construction of the legend of Sylvie Lefebvre was an operation in itself, a masterpiece of bureaucratic and digital forgery undertaken by a specialized unit within the Mossad known as Caesarea. The goal was to create not just a cover story, but a verifiable reality. A birth certificate was forged and expertly inserted into the municipal archives in Lyon, France. University transcripts from the Sorbonne, complete with grades and professors' signatures, were created and planted in the university's records. To build a financial history, a bank account was opened in her name at a Credit Lyonnais branch in Paris. For a full year leading up to the operation, this account was used for plausible transactions, small, regular deposits from a shell company posing as an art dealership, rent payments for a real apartment in Lyon that was kept empty for her, and purchases of art supplies, books, and train tickets. A French passport and driver's license were produced, not as forgeries, but as genuine documents obtained through a compromised official in the French Ministry of the Interior. Her portfolio was a work of artifice. The technical division, using advanced aging techniques and period-appropriate materials, created a dozen small canvases and wooden icons that they then restored, photographing every stage of the process to create a believable body of work. Even her personal effects were curated with obsessive detail. The books on her shelf in Rome would be well-read editions of Camus and Flaubert, with underlined passages and marginalia written in her own hand. The clothes in her closet were purchased from French department stores, their labels consistent with her supposed income and background. A small, almost unnoticeable detail was the inclusion of a cat. A Mossad behavioral psychologist had argued that caring for a pet would significantly enhance her cover, grounding her in a routine of domesticity and normalcy that would be difficult to fake and would serve as a powerful psychological buffer against the isolation of the mission. A ginger cat named Pamplemousse was procured and became her silent, unwitting partner in the deception. The technology developed for Operation Fresco was tailored to the unique constraints of extreme close-quarters intelligence gathering. It was designed to be analog, invisible, and utterly deniable. The primary audio surveillance tool was not a traditional bug, but a set of 3 identical buttons on a tweed coat she often wore. One of these buttons, indistinguishable from the others, contained a high-fidelity, sound-activated micro-recorder with a 12-hour capacity. Activating it required a specific, complex sequence of pressures and twists that could not be triggered accidentally. To exfiltrate the audio, the button could be discreetly detached and swapped with one of the identical, inert spares during a visit to a public restroom, the compromised button then being left in a prearranged dead drop location. For visual intelligence, her team eschewed cameras in favor of a far more subtle technique. She was supplied with a small, innocuous-looking tin of sketching charcoal. Several of the sticks were not charcoal at all, but a compressed compound of a rare earth element that, when used to draw, would leave behind a faint, invisible residue. If she observed Swader handling a specific document, map, or notebook, she could later, under the pretense of tidying up, discreetly brush the object with the treated charcoal stick. The document would then be tagged. This tag was crucial for the next stage. Mossad surveillance teams following Swader's known couriers were equipped with compact, highly sensitive ultraviolet spectrometers. A quick scan of a briefcase or a book passed between a courier and another operative could detect the unique spectral signature of the rare earth element, confirming that the object had come directly from Swader's presence and was therefore of high intelligence value, marking it for potential interception. Communication with her handler was conducted through a system of layered cutouts and dead drops. Her primary method of passing on written reports was a hollowed-out tube of oil paint. She would write her observations in microdot script on a tiny roll of film, place it inside the tube, and reseal it. The tube would then be left in a specific bin at a designated art supply store, to be collected by another agent posing as a student. The system was slow and laborious, but it was silent, electronically untraceable, and, if she were ever compromised, left no incriminating equipment in her possession. Alona's insertion into Rome, now fully embodying the persona of Sylvie Lefebvre, was a deliberate exercise in patience. She arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. She rented the apartment in Piazza Mattei, a location chosen for its proximity to the Jewish ghetto, a neighborhood whose historical weight and labyrinthine alleys offered a rich tapestry for surveillance and escape routes, and was also a place Swader was known to walk through, perhaps finding a grim irony in its history. She spent the first 2 months establishing her patterns, creating the rhythm of a normal life. She bought groceries at the Campo de Fiore market, took her morning coffee at the same small bar, and established a nodding acquaintance with her neighbors. She secured a legitimate, albeit minor, restoration commission at a small, unassuming church, a job that had been subtly arranged for her through a Mossad front organization masquerading as a cultural heritage foundation. This work gave her a perfect, unassailable reason for her presence in the city and for the tools and chemicals in her apartment. Her strategy for making contact with Swader was indirect. Using intelligence about his habits, she began to frequent the same spaces he did, but always on the periphery. She attended poetry readings at a bookstore in Trastevere where he was sometimes seen, sitting in the back, quietly sketching the speakers in her notebook. She visited a small gallery known to be a favorite of his, lingering over the expressionist paintings he admired. She never made eye contact, never initiated a conversation. The goal was to become part of the scenery, a familiar, non-threatening presence in his world. She was baiting a trap not with allure, but with stillness, allowing his own curiosity and intellectual ego to be the mechanism that would spring it. The first contact occurred after nearly 3 months of painstaking groundwork. It was a cool November afternoon at an outdoor table at Rosati, a café in the Piazza del Popolo. Alona was sketching the Fontana dei Quattro Leoni, her focus apparently consumed by the task. Zweiter, who was sitting 2 tables away with a newspaper, eventually walked over, his curiosity piqued. He commented in Italian on the quality of her line work, and the conversation began. As planned, it was a conversation not about politics, but about art. She spoke of her work, her admiration for the raw emotional power of Caravaggio. He, in turn, spoke of the parallels between the structure of a painting and the cadence of a poem. It was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated intellectual courtship. Over the next several weeks, the encounters became more frequent, evolving from chance meetings into planned coffees and long walks through the Villa Borghese gardens. Alona played her role to perfection. She was intelligent but unassuming, thoughtful but never provocative. When he would occasionally steer the conversation towards the politics of the Middle East, she would respond with the carefully rehearsed lines of a well-meaning but ultimately uninformed European liberal, expressing a vague sympathy for the Palestinian plight but quickly professing her own ignorance of the conflict's complexities. This feigned political naivete was her shield. It defined her as safe, as someone outside of his world of conspiracy and violence, a respite from the pressures of his clandestine life. During these meetings, her operational tradecraft was in constant, silent motion. On a walk along the Tiber, wearing her tweed coat, she activated the button recorder as he took a brief, hushed phone call, capturing a few crucial seconds in which he mentioned a shipment of ceramics and a contact named Abu Rami. On another occasion, after he had lent her a volume of poetry by Mahmoud Darwish, she subtly dusted the book's cover with the invisible tracking compound before returning it a week later. 2 days after that, a surveillance team reported a positive spectrometer reading from a briefcase carried by a known PFLP courier who had a brief encounter with Zweiter near the Pantheon. The pieces of the puzzle were being gathered, slowly and silently, one conversation, one particle of dust at a time. The climax of Operation Fresco, when it came, was not a dramatic shootout or a tense confrontation involving Alona. Her role was to provide the blueprint, the demolition was left to others. After 5 months of patient, painstaking work, she had assembled a remarkably complete picture of Zweiter's network. She had identified his 3 key lieutenants, the safe houses they used for meetings, the front companies that handled the logistics, and, most critically, the method and timing of the next major shipment. The intelligence, cross-referenced with signals intercepts from a separate Mossad operation targeting PFLP communications in Beirut, indicated that a large consignment of Semtex and detonators was due to arrive at the port of Civitavecchia, concealed within a cargo of industrial-grade olive oil tins being shipped from Lebanon. The tins containing the explosives were marked with a nearly imperceptible variation in their labeling. On the night of March 28, 1973, as Alona sat in her apartment listening to a Vivaldi concerto, her cat asleep on her lap, the operational arm of the Mossad, the Kaidan unit, went into action. In a series of silent, coordinated raids conducted in conjunction with a specialized unit of the Italian Carabinieri, who were officially acting on an anonymous tip from a non-existent informant, the network was decapitated. At the port, the specific container was isolated and the marked tins were seized, yielding over 100 kilograms of plastic explosives. Simultaneously, the 3 lieutenants were apprehended in their apartments across Rome. The evidence collected in these raids was overwhelming, leading to the immediate collapse of the entire European distribution chain. The operation was a stunning, bloodless success, achieved not with explosives, but with information. Alona's extraction was executed with the same clinical precision as the rest of the operation. An hour before the raids commenced, she received the activation signal, a wrong number phone call to her apartment in which the caller asked for Senior Rossi. This was the prearranged signal to exfiltrate immediately. Her protocol was clear and well rehearsed. There was no frantic packing. She calmly stood, fed her cat, and left a full bowl of water. She took only her purse, containing her French passport and a small amount of cash. Everything else, the art supplies, the clothes, the books, the entire physical manifestation of Sylvie Lefebvre, was abandoned. The cat, Pamplemousse, would be retrieved the next day by another agent posing as a representative from an animal welfare society, alerted by a concerned neighbor. She walked out of her apartment building and did not look back. She followed a predetermined, circuitous route through the back streets of the ghetto, a path she had walked in her mind 100 times. After 20 minutes, she entered a small cinema, bought a ticket, went into the women's restroom, and emerged 5 minutes later. Her hair, previously a light brown, was now tucked under a dark wig. Her stylish coat had been replaced with a simple raincoat taken from her bag, and she now wore glasses. The transformation was subtle but effective. She exited the cinema through a side door and walked to a designated bus stop, where a nondescript Fiat was waiting. She got in the back seat without a word. The car drove north, crossing the Swiss border at Chiasso before dawn. The identity of Sylvie Lefebvre, the quiet art restorer, had evaporated into the Roman night as if she had never been. The aftermath of Operation Fresco was a profound strategic victory for the Israeli intelligence community. The seizure of the explosives and the arrest of the key logistical personnel effectively shattered the PFLP's operational capacity in Western Europe for years to come. The documents and ledgers recovered in the raids provided a treasure trove of intelligence, leading to subsequent arrests and the disruption of nascent cells in France, West Germany, and Belgium. Diplomatically, the operation was a ghost. The Italian government, while privately aware that the anonymous tip was almost certainly of Israeli origin, was content to claim a major counterterrorism victory for its own forces, avoiding the political complexities that would arise from acknowledging a foreign intelligence operation on their soil. While later, his network dismantled and his cover in Rome effectively blown, was left exposed and isolated. Although he was not arrested in the initial raids, his operational value was nullified. He was assassinated several months later, a separate operation that was the final, brutal punctuation mark on the intelligence Alona had provided. But for Alona herself, the return from the cold was a disorienting and painful process. She spent 6 weeks in a secure debriefing facility, meticulously recounting every conversation, every observation, every nuance of her time as Sylvie. The psychological cost of the operation became apparent. For almost a year, she had lived a life of profound intimacy with a man she was tasked to destroy. She had discussed poetry with him, shared meals with him, and listened to his stories of a lost homeland. To be effective, her feigned friendship had to contain elements of genuine rapport. She had to understand him, to appreciate his intellect and his charm, in order to successfully deceive him. The man she had come to know was not a monster, but a complex, intelligent, and even gentle individual who was also, undeniably, a purveyor of mass death. This irreconcilable duality haunted her. The clinical detachment required of an operative had been eroded by the sustained, daily performance of human connection. The operation was logged in the Mossad's archives as a complete success, a model of deep cover penetration. But Alona was left with the quiet, lingering ambiguity of her victory, a permanent psychic scar that served as a testament to the profound and often unacknowledged human price of the shadow wars. Is the cultivation of a false friendship, a deep psychological manipulation, a justifiable weapon in the fight against terrorism? At what point does the necessary deception of espionage become an unacceptable corruption of the self? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.